Hello folks, welcome back to Medieval Mondays, and today we're finally going to be getting into Edward the First Crusade, the actual crusading part of the crusade. Now for the citizens of Acre, the arrival of Edward's fleet would have been a relief. The city had been under siege by Baibar's forces for a very long time, up until this point. Now if you don't know who Baibars was, just imagine Jorge Masvidal. Let's say the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 was UFC 235. The Mongolian army was Ben Askren's head. Jorge Masvidal's knee was Baibar's army. And I'm not hating on the Mongols at all, but that's how big of an upset, or rather a shock, that battle was. It was extremely devastating to the Mongol forces. The Mongol expansion, as a matter of fact, would be halted by Baibar's territory, and they would never be able to expand beyond that point. Now, internal strife did have to do with them not being able to avenge that defeat. They were actually defeated shortly after that battle, again by Baibar's forces. And like I said, they never expanded beyond his territory, and he would go on to fight the Mongols some more. So if you want a video on Baibars, I will do one. Actually, whether you guys request one or not, I'm going to do a video on him anyway. But comment down below if you would like a video on Baibars, and if you would like a video on the Mamluk warriors themselves. So, Baibars was not a man to be fooled with. And when he heard that Edward had arrived at Acre, he was actually planning to go and lay siege to the city of Tripoli. Rather than having to fight on two fronts and have to let Edward cause trouble where he was located at Acre, he decided to give the city of Tripoli a 10-year truce and march with his forces and approach the city of Acre. Now, when he came into viewing point of Acre, he did not lay siege to the city right away. He decided to size up this new foe shrewdly. And instead, he took his forces and laid siege to the nearby city of Montfort. And the people there surrendered very quickly to him. So, Baibars then captured the entire military garrison, walked in front of the city of Acre with his army there, and released the garrison he just captured right in front of them. He was sending a message to Edward to let him know that he was in his territory. Now, this psychological warfare that he was using is very effective. You know, picture somebody basically taking your sword from you, beating you, and then giving your sword back. They're like, okay, you're not a threat to me at all. This was the message he was sending to Edward, letting you know, you're here as long as I want you to be here. You're absolutely no threat. I can crush you anytime I desire to. So, Edward realized that, you know, this man was not a man to be trifled with. The following day, the Sultan took his forces and left. He didn't lay siege to the city of Acre. He just showed them who was boss, then went about his way. Now, Edward, 2 months later, wound up ignoring the warnings that Baibars had given and wound up laying siege to the city of St. George, 12 miles away from Acre. And they succeeded in capturing a whole lot of cattle, seizing some crops, destroying others, and killing several Muslims in the area. But the unusual diet and the heat began to set in for the Crusaders, and they realized that, you know, wearing a heavy mail shirt inside of Jerusalem, where they had not grown up, sorry, not Jerusalem, inside of Palestine, very hot area, was not, it was no cakewalk for them. So Edward realized that if he wanted to defeat Baibars, he would have to do two things. One, he would need some allies, and two, he would have to wait for the months to get cooler. He could count on the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the titular king of Jerusalem, and the king of Cyprus also offered military support to Edward. However, Edward had also done another very cunning and very wise move. The day after he showed up inside of Acre, he dispatched 3 of his family relatives, and sorry, I said family relatives, family household, and sent them on an extremely deadly mission. And what he wanted them to do was go to Aga Khan, the ruler of the Mongols, and get them as allies. Now, the trip took a long time for them to get there, and it was very dangerous. They had to cross through the Sultan's territory, make it there alive, and deliver a message, and then they had to make it all the way back. Now, the Sultan, sorry, not the Sultan, Aga Khan would not come himself, but he would be sending one of his lieutenants with thousands of soldiers to go and assist him. It took a while for the letter to arrive, and by the time the letter was on its way, the Mongols were already moving. Now, they planned on doing a two-pronged attack. The plan was this. The Mongols would come from the north and attack the Sultan's forces, while Edward would raid in the south, while the Sultan's forces were distracted, fighting the Mongols. So by November, the Mongols had driven the Mamluks' forces outside of the city of Aleppo and had taken it for themselves. The Sultan then gathered all of his forces together and marched up north to attack the Mongols and drive them outside the city of Aleppo. This was the opportunity Edward was waiting for. He gathered all his forces together and marched to the city of Kakan, 40 miles away from the city of Acre. Now, they laid siege to the area, and they succeeded in raiding a lot of the cattle, burning some more crops, capturing others, and killing many Muslims outside, and then they laid siege to the city itself, which was the only city blocking them, the only castle, blocking them from Jerusalem. which was 30 miles beyond Kakan, and they failed. They were not able to take the city. Contrary to movie belief, a siege is not an easy task. You can't just rush in there and do it. A lot of things go into a siege. You need a lot of time, a lot of planning, a lot of equipment, and so on. And even though Edward had success in the past at laying siege to cities rather quickly during the Civil War, this was not the case. The city was very well guarded. The Sultan had added defenses to it. There were several ditches that were deep, filled with water surrounding the city. It was a very impressive defensive mechanism. And not only that, when the relief force sent by the Sultan showed up, according to some sources, they actually chased the Crusaders back to the city of Acre. So this was a failure. Not only that, more failure would follow, because in the north, when the Sultan began to approach the city of Aleppo, the Mongols just abandoned it and retreated away from the Sultan without even engaging in a fight. And by December, the city was back in his hands. And while inside the city, he heard of the failed siege of the city of Kakan, and he's credited with saying, "If so many men cannot even take a house, how can they hope to take the kingdom of Jerusalem?" And, I just love the Sultan's attitude towards Edward right now. He's just like, really, dude? Is that the best you've got? Come on, give me some more. So he was not at all worried about what Edward was doing, and he gathered his forces and planned to go avenge, or rather punish, since he wasn't defeated, go punish Edward in March. But bad weather canceled his plans. Comment down below what you think the Sultan would have done to Edward to punish him for laying siege to the city of Kakan, since it didn't happen with an army. Now, the following month, Edward was not licked yet. He had not given up. He still desired to keep this fight going on. In April, he started to build another defensive tower inside the city of Acre because he wanted to continue fighting the Sultan. However, he was disappointed when he found out later on that the surrounding political forces, the kings and lords around the area, had solidified a 10-year truce with the Sultan. And Edward was upset. Well, upset is an understatement. He was furious, and he actually refused to abide by the truce. He was going to continue hostilities against the Sultan. Now, you might be wondering why on earth did all the Crusaders betray Edward that way? Or, sorry, not the Crusaders, but all the surrounding places betray Edward and decide to make peace with their enemy. Well, simply put, there was more profit in peace than there was in war. The Mediterranean to this day is still a great trade center, and back then it was the trade center of the world. A whole lot of trade went around through the ports, and Acre was a port city. So if they're fighting over it, while they're constantly fighting, there's no money being brought in from the trade. So there was much more profit in peaceful trade with the Muslims and with the other religions of the area than there was in unnecessary hostilities. So the businessmen saw it as, there's no profit in us fighting them, so why are we fighting? Edward desired this fight. We don't. We'll take peace with the Sultan. Edward's lone stance and his religious belief and his desire, his zealousy in wanting to continue this fight made him a loose cannon among everybody else. So the Sultan decided to get rid of him. And he sent one of his own men and told him, I want you to pretend to be joining Edward's side. And when you get the opportunity, kill him. So the assassin went about his duty, and Edward actually welcomed him to Acre with open arms. And and this may seem strange to some people, but remember, during the English Civil War, there were people who changed sides multiple times. So it probably wasn't unusual for Edward. So the assassin was inside the city of Acre, and he bided his time. And on June 17th, which was also Edward's birthday, he struck. When he was alone with Edward, he drew a dagger, which, according to some accounts, was poison, and tried to kill him. But Edward, by this point, is as you know, he's no pushover. The man had been in personal combat several times with knights, so he succeeded in killing the assassin, but not before receiving a wound to his leg himself. Now, back then, a lot of people talk about how dangerous wounds were when they became infected, and this is one of the cases. Edward, as a matter of fact, was so worried that he might not live through the wound that the following day he drew up his will. Now, according to some accounts, Eleanor was there and attempted to suck the poison out of the wound in Edward's leg. I don't know if the story's true or not. I wasn't there, but I do believe Eleanor was certainly a tough woman to stand by him through this and to be on this crusade in the first place. So, kudos to her. But the days began to go on and on. Edward got weaker and weaker. And eventually, his leg became infected. The flesh around it started to turn black. And so eventually they decided, we're going to cut off all the flesh, which was just as dangerous as possibly letting Edward live. But they cut the flesh off. He began to recover his strength. And by this point, the crusade was pretty much over. They had pretty much, zero success military-wise. They had gone on some successful raids, but as far as achieving their objective of making it to the city of Jerusalem, which was only 30 miles from them, they weren't able to achieve. They weren't able to take the city of Kakan, and one of their own cities had been laid siege to, and twice they made a 10-year truce with the Sultan on his terms and his call. The following month, Edmund went home, and Edward and Eleanor did intend to go back with him, but Edward still had to heal up from his injuries, and Eleanor had just given birth to a little daughter who they named Joan, so they decided we're going to wait till a little healthier before going. However, when September and favorable winds came, Eleanor and Edward bid farewell to the Holy Land and sailed back to the Kingdom of Sicily, where Edward would rest before deciding his next move.